Some of you know that I entered Mount Angel Seminary in August 2016. And in order to do that, I had to sell my home and give away or sell most of my stuff. And it was easy to do that for the most part. I haven't really missed most of that stuff. However, there are two things that I really do miss. And one of those things is my gas stove, because I like to cook and gas stoves are the best. But the other thing that I miss, and especially this time of year, is my garden. I actually love gardening, especially vegetables and things you can eat, but I also enjoyed keeping up the flowers and the shrub beds. Since I entered seminary, I've not been able to do any gardening, and I miss it. Now, I don't know that you could say that I was particularly good at it, but I can tell you that I certainly wasn't bad at it, and I had fairly good success. Whenever I purchased a home, I was always careful to figure out where I could locate my vegetable garden and what, if anything, I'd need to do to either rehabilitate the soil or figure out what it might need to maximize its ability to grow things. Now, my point here is that I know quite a bit about gardening, but I'll come back to that in just a minute. With today's gospel reading, we enter into a new portion of Matthew's gospel. And this part of that gospel deals with Jesus' teaching through the parables that he used. Now, the parables are a kind of story that compares two things to each other, but they also have an aspect to them that is kind of like a riddle. And because of that, they're usually directed to those most inclined to understand their real hidden meaning. Remember, we spoke last week about Jesus speaking in a kind of code. Well, this is one way in which he did that. And so these parables contain hidden meanings, and it's our job to figure that out. And so today we have the parable of the sower, or the gardener. And I don't mind telling you that as a former gardener, the guy that Jesus is talking about, the guy planting the seeds, doesn't seem to have any idea what he is doing. In fact, he seems completely incompetent. And here's why. Seeds and seedlings are not particularly cheap, and yet our gardener seems to be flinging seed as though he has an unlimited supply. As a gardener, I'd never do that. And not only is he extravagant with his seed supply, but he also seems pretty reckless. On top of that, he tosses those seeds as though he's tossing confetti, and he's throwing those seeds anywhere and everywhere, and that seems crazy. So let's say I go to Home Depot or Lowe's or Fred Meyer and I buy my seeds. Not only am I going to buy just enough, but I'm also going to avoid planting them where they should not be planted. Unlike the gardener in Jesus' story, I would not toss them onto the driveway or on the gravel path, and most certainly not in the rose bushes. Those are not places for good, expensive seed, because over time, the seeds won't grow well, if at all, in those places. The gardener that Jesus is describing sounds pretty bad because he doesn't seem to have a clue about what he is doing. And I don't doubt that Jesus' audience would have thought the same thing as I did. And then Jesus speaks of some of the seed falling on the good, rich soil, of it taking root and growing well there. Now, it's at this point that the parable kind of matches my experience with gardening. But unlike the gardener in the parable, I would prepare the soil by turning it over, and then I'd hoe it, and then I'd rake it. And then I'd plant those seeds in either little mounds of dirt or in little furrows. And I'd put them exactly where I'd want them and where I could reach them with water or with my hands to make sure that only the seeds would grow there. But then Jesus goes on to say that that seed produced a lot of fruit, 30 and 60 and 100-fold. But here's the thing. An average harvest in Jesus' day could be expected to bring a 7.5-fold harvest. Tenfold would be great. But 30 or 60 or 100? Well, we're now in the area of the miraculous. And regardless, that would have been incredibly fruitful and completely unexpected, because the gardener is an incompetent boob. So what's going on here? Clearly, the disciples didn't have a clue, because they asked Jesus to explain it. And thankfully, he does. So Jesus obviously is the gardener, and the seed that he's planting is the message of God. And while he is careless with the way he flings the seed everywhere, he actually intends that, because he isn't just bringing the message to those who will hear it and respond, he brings it to everybody. The problem is that there are different kinds of soils. And the first is the road on which the seed falls, where everyone walks or drives. And the birds come along and they eat it. Now, this soil would be the people who hear Jesus or his message, but the message makes no impact on them because it isn't planted in their hearts. It just hits the surface before it's gobbled up by something else. And that would be the folks whose eyes and ears are closed to the gospel. The seed is given, but it does not take root. And then next is the rocky ground. That would be the person who hears the word of God in the beginning and is excited and happy about it and begins to become a disciple. But soon, maybe persecution or hardship sets in and that person falls away. The sprouted seeds don't have enough soil, and so it withers because the roots can't go deep enough for the plant to live. Those people would have been those who heard Jesus, and while they got excited enough to begin following him, they decided to quit because of the difficulty and the persecution or the rejection. The third kind of soil would be where the thorny plants were. Now, there's plenty of soil there and enough for the plants to grow, but as it grows, it's surrounded by other plants that will choke it out. Jesus says that the thorns represent the cares of the world and a love of wealth. And those would be unnecessary worldly concerns that would be serious enough distractions that would prevent that kind of person from being spiritually productive. And then finally, there's the good soil, and Jesus identifies the good soil with the person who hears the word of God and understands it. These are the people who take his word into their minds and their hearts, and the word of God can develop roots that will actually help that person bear fruit, and a lot of it. That fruit would in part be the